Hello everyone, it's me, Emelena, and today I'm going to be talking about a game that many people describe as life-changing, and at the very least, people have said it has changed their opinions on political division. And that game is, of course, Disco Elysium. Now this is a game that is heavily political and extremely philosophical, yet again making it another game that I am far too stupid to talk about. But I'm gonna try, because there was one aspect of the game that really stood out to me, and if you're familiar with my channel, it should probably already be obvious. It is the voices that Harry speaks to, his thoughts. I think they're called the thought cabinet or something like that he speaks to throughout the game. The two big ones that I really want to talk about are Half-Light and Volition, because they resemble the voices that I hear in my head very often. And that was really the main thing I took from this game, because I'm playing it from the perspective of someone who hears voices. And Harry obviously suffers from a mental illness, because alcoholism, drug addiction, is a mental illness, but also he's deeply depressed and he has low self-esteem amongst very many other problems. He seems to be riddled with anxiety as well, which is like what Half-Light is, in my opinion. That's just a whole entire intrusive thought and also anxiety rolled into one. And so I wanted to do a little bit of an analysis on Disco Elysium and how it made me feel. Disco Elysium holds no punches. It shows you the horrible impact of unrestrained capitalism on a population while poking fun at every political leaning possible. This isn't a black and white game. No, it's quite nuanced in its approach and critiques. You'd have to be actively not listening to miss how political this game gets. Essentially, all the NPCs you talk to bring up politics with the exception of a few. The game often puts Harry, the playable character, in a number of conversations I'd clock as philosophical as well. After playing Disco Elysium, there was one thing I couldn't shake. As a schizoaffective person, my disorder unfortunately colors my life. No, I don't allow it to define me, but I cannot deny that the symptoms often influence my thoughts, feelings, and outlook. Much like Harry, my perspective is permanently tainted by a disease that follows me. In Harry's case, it's alcoholism. The reason Disco Elysium stuck with me long after playing wasn't the critique of capitalism or the philosophy. It wasn't Harry's unfortunate isolation and propensity for drug use or his obsession with his ex. It was the thoughts that Harry had talked to him, as I previously mentioned. Harry, in his own words, has conversations with his brain the same way I have conversations with my voices. The biggest difference is the tone and usefulness of these conversations. 99% of the voices I hear aren't helpful or kind. They're rude or random. They tell me what to do or what not to do. They try to make me feel bad about my life. Like Half-Light, the voices can be intrusive and irrational. They can whisper or yell, they can be calm or dramatic, it all depends. And as I played through Disco Elysium, I was continuously reminded of how the voices in my head operate. Volition in particular stood out due to me having an encouraging voice much like it. Like I said, 99% of my voices are not great, but there is one that tries to get me to do good, and that even seems to look out for me from time to time. Volition did exactly this for Harry. There were many times throughout Disco Elysium that I was shocked at how much Volition sounded like that voice in my head, just as calm and kind and put together. Then you've got Half-Light, who I mentioned earlier, and this fucking guy, I swear to God, if you've ever had intrusive thoughts, I'm sure Half-Light stood out to you. It is exactly like some of the thoughts that force their way in. Half-Light loves to threaten everyone and anyone. It treats every interaction like a potential for unnecessary violence, even against children. The most interesting part about Half-Light, not life, Half-Light, is you can just ignore him. In fact, throughout the game, Harry ignores a great deal of intrusive, negative, unhinged thoughts depending on your choices. And I found that to be quite funny, because that is how it is if you hear voices. You've got to ignore the wild shit and try to focus on the positive stuff. Best case scenario is you drown them out and manage until they relent. Worst case scenario is you give in to the commands and do some wild shit. Disco Elysium brutally confronts the side effects of capitalism's reign, and it does it without holding back. One of the most depressing characters in the story is Kuno, a child with a drug addiction, something I've seen in my life due to living in poverty-stricken areas. Many characters are on their last legs, some running from their past, others barely hanging on. Harry isn't even the only character with a serious addiction. You actually see that quite a lot throughout the game. When speaking with the dice maker, she outright tells you, there is no curse, it's just capitalism. This game confronts reality, it mirrors our world, and it's extremely hard to stomach sometimes. A scene that caused me a lot of pain was with the pigs, a mentally ill woman with no family to care for her. Naturally, she ended up on the streets, alone, lost, confused, possibly on drugs, and during the confrontation with her, she has your gun. This quarrel could have gone sour very quickly, but during my first playthrough, I was able to get the weapon from her and get people to help her. The reality is, though, that people like the pigs exist in the real world and will be discarded and forgotten frequently. The critique of a failing system barely hides itself in this game. I am one of those people who can easily fall through the cracks and end up in the same place as the pigs. In fact, it's one of my greatest fears. In my own life, I've seen this more than once. I remember when my area cut funding to free mental health services, it wasn't long before someone did something horribly violent. Someone who sought help on more than one occasion but was turned down by the state. The state failed this person and ultimately all their victims. The main story of Disco Elysium is quite normal, boring even, but the world around it is where you find the more interesting things. From the voices in your head to Kim's unreasonable acceptance of all your actions, he is quite unhinged himself, I found, to dealing with a population that can't stop yapping about politics, to the most existential thing I've ever heard, this game has it all. There's even a love story, well, kind of. Speaking of the most existential thing in Disco Elysium, let's talk about it. Something that really chewed away at my brain during gameplay. The existence of the Pale. I found the Pale to be one of the most interesting aspects of the game, even more interesting than the political and philosophical aspects, even more interesting than Harry himself. I have a fear of infinity, of things never ending and folding into themselves. The concept of the Pale isn't exactly infinity, in fact it could be interpreted as the opposite. Joyce mentions that some people theorize that the Pale is remnants of the past that are degrading, and somehow this contributes to how the Pale damages our minds when traveling through it. She also notes that the Pale outnumbers matter 2 to 1, and that ratio is declining. The Pale is eating away at matter by the day. I'm not going to sit here and act like I understand what the Pale is. I simply don't. But from what I can gather, it is the embodiment of nothingness. And that nothingness eats away at everything, as Joyce describes. Something whose fundamental property is the suspension of other properties. Physical, epistemological, I can't believe I was able to pronounce that word, linguistic. The further into the Pale you travel, the steeper the degree of suspension. Right down to the mathematical. Numbers stop working. No one has yet passed the number barrier. It may be impossible. The Pale is, and I quote, less than nothing. In the church is a 2mm hole in the world, and if you pass through the right checks during a certain part of the game, you find out that the hole is the Pale. The Pale is present in the church, and it is very likely that the church was actually built around it. Harry says it's already devouring reality, starting with sound. Suna describes the Pale as a shroud of memory, furthering the idea that it is eating away at past information. Now, I don't really understand this, but it does fucking scare me. I can only imagine a void pulling the very concept of matter into it. If you listen to what the Phasmid says, the Pale is a result of human consciousness, which is a wild concept. What is the Pale? Why does it seem to swallow reality? And why did our consciousness cause it to come into existence? You can apply all those questions to psychosis, by the way. I don't know what the Pale is, though there is plenty of speculation. One thing I did associate it with is how mental illness eats away at who you really are. And the longer I played through the game, the deeper this association got. The Pale began to represent symptoms slowly taking away memories, your sense of self, devouring reality and replacing it with a cold, dark nothing. I'm aware this is a personal interpretation, especially since I recently watched a video about the Pale made by somebody who read the book, and there are a lot of things clarified that I still don't understand. But one thing I learned is that it may be possible to get information from the future through certain sensitive people. Harry may be one, which is why he's seemingly psychic. Bringing this future information into the present is why the Pale exists. So what I'm saying is my associating it with mental illness has more to do with me than with the writer's intent. Although I will say this, comparisons between the Pale and addiction make sense when you think about Harry and his main coping mechanism. I don't doubt the writer understood this. Disco Elysium is like a brain worm. It crawls in quietly, sometimes unnoticed, but slowly it begins to take over your thoughts and affect your feelings. The world of Revachol isn't very different from our own. Depending on where you are in the world, the sights and sounds of Revachol may seem quite unfamiliar or foreign, but trust and believe, there are places in reality just like it. And when it comes to the Pale, there are also places in reality just like it. They're found in chronic pain, illnesses, diseases, addictions. After finishing this game, I had to sit back and think about what I'd just taken in and come to conclusions about reality that I didn't think a silly drunk detective game would have me pondering on. Overall, I'd recommend this game to anyone looking for a perspective-changing human experience. This game didn't do for me what it did for a lot of other people. If you read through YouTube comment sections, you will see people saying this game changed their life and changed the way they think about things, and like I mentioned before, changed their ideas on political division. It opened a lot of people's minds to the fact that people have their political beliefs for reasons, and it doesn't mean they're evil or wrong for having them. And if we would just open a dialogue with each other, we could see that there is middle ground to be found. There's a lot of people who had that take on this game. There are people who said it was life-changing. Somebody who was watching me stream it said that, like, it even made them cry at some point with, like, some of the stuff with Harry's ex. And I didn't really take much of that from the game. I didn't, like, have, like, a life-changing experience because of Disco Elysium. But it really did stand out to me because of how Harry talks to the voices in his head. And I just wanted to focus on that and how the pale reminds me of mental illness. And I know this wasn't like the most in-depth analysis, but I would flinch sometimes at how realistic Volition and Half-Light were when it comes to intrusive thoughts and having that one kind voice that has my back, right? And there were times during this game where I wanted to cry when Volition would talk because it just sounded so much like that encouraging voice in my head. And there were times in this game when I would just get so infuriated with Half-Light. And I realized that if the voices in my head were a lot more useful and kind, then they wouldn't be a detriment. They would be helpful. And this game really affected me on a level of me thinking, like, I wish the disorder I had was more helpful than harmful. I wish that hearing voices in your head could be the way they are with Harry, where they're very useful and they help him see things, like, you know, his logic and his empathy help him see things that maybe he didn't see before. I wish the voices in my head were like that, but unfortunately they're not. And that's why this game affected me deeply. And I just wanted to say that. Another reason it affected me pretty deeply is the blatant critique of capitalism. I myself think of myself as sort of a victim of capitalism and the way that it treats the mentally ill or people who are not useful and productive in society. I still carry the ideas that if I don't work, which I don't right now, then I'm useless and I don't deserve my life. I don't deserve to live in society. And I still think that. I used to be a workaholic because I was so obsessed with making money and contributing to society and to my household that I didn't understand that I have self-worth just by being human or have worth just by being human. And I still try to tell myself I have worth, but capitalism has brainwashed me into believing that I am a useless entity who doesn't deserve to live because of my disorder and the fact that I cannot work, 80 hours a week like other people can, That's all I really wanted to say. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you guys again. If you liked the video, go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you, and have a great day.